Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I am your host, Attorney Henry Gornbein. Today on Gracefully Graying, I am very pleased to welcome as my guest former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan and best-selling author Barbara McQuade, whose two books, the first one, which I reviewed with her a number of years ago, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, and her new bestseller, The Fix, Saving America from Corruption and Mob-Style Government. Excellent must-reads, and especially in these very frightening times, are so true. So without further ado, let me welcome as my guest, Barbara McQuade.
Hi, Henry. Thanks for having me. Wonderful to be with you again.
Well, it's a pleasure having you. I mean, you do such wonderful work. First of all, let's start by telling our viewers a little bit about who you are and your background.
Well, I was born in Detroit, but I will spare you all the gory details. Became a lawyer, served as a federal prosecutor in Detroit, and left there in 2017. I was the presidentially appointed U.S. attorney in the Obama administration. So when his term ended, so did mine. And now I teach at the University of Michigan Law School.
Go Blue, my alma mater as well. Barbara, tell us why you decided to call your book The Fix.
Well, it has sort of two meanings. The first is something that I think I am seeing through the lens of a former prosecutor. I spent the bulk of my career, 20 years, as a federal prosecutor. And what I see going on in our government today, and I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, certainly there are all kinds of policy issues on which we can disagree and have vigorous debate. That is all part of democracy. But what I see is an administration that is using some of the same tactics that I saw as a federal prosecutor to govern. And that is the application of power for the purpose of achieving more power, using leverage, finding any pain point possible, and then using that to coerce the opposing party, whether it's a rival in the media or in politics or in universities, and coercing them to come to the table to negotiate their own punishment. And we can talk about some details of it. I think the Gordie Howe Bridge, by the way, is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But so in some ways, it's this mob style way of leading. It is this use of power. So, the fix is in. But the other way the fix is used in the book is to solve problems. That this is something we can fix in a democracy. We, the people, ultimately have all the power. And so if we can figure out which guardrails to put into place, and if we can use our collective power in a united fashion to take back those processes of democracy, then we can fix what's broken in our system.
Very true words. And you begin each chapter with some of your real life experiences as a prosecutor. And what's interesting, I think the first chapter of the book, you talk about Kwame Kilpatrick, who you prosecuted in the Eastern District of Michigan when you were the U.S. attorney. So how did this color review about what is going on in our country now?
Yeah, so that case was an interesting example of the use of power to achieve more power. So one of the things that Mayor Kilpatrick was convicted of, among other crimes, extortion, bribery, fraud, tax offenses, was this kickback scheme. And that was in awarding very lucrative public service contracts, water, sewer contracts. He would, and his team would demand kickbacks from the contractors if they wanted to do business. And so sometimes people resisted for a long time and said, no, I don't want to pay that kickback. But one of the things I learned in watching that is that once you pay the extortionist one time, they own you and you can't get out from under it. So this contractor who was very reluctant and resisted many times and lost contracts ultimately agreed to pay a kickback so that he could get a very lucrative contract for the benefit of his employees and his family and his business. But once he made that payment, then Mayor Kilpatrick's associates would keep coming back for more, demanding more money. And what could he do? He couldn't go to the police and complain. He'd already been complicit in a bribe, right? Complain that these people I bribed or want more bribes. You can't really do that without confessing to your own role in the scheme. And so people are isolated and silenced, and the extortionist keeps coming back for more. The simplest example is the playground bully who demands your lunch money. The one who gives in and gives the money to the bully is the one that sort of brands themselves the easy mark, and the bully keeps coming back for more. And so I think we've seen this throughout the Trump administration. There's no appeasing him, with some of the things that we've seen with foreign allies, with the tariffs, or universities in demands to end their DEI programs, or law firms whom he's accused of weaponization and lawfare simply by affiliating themselves with certain lawyers who have taken on Donald Trump, like Robert Mueller or Mark Elias, who once represented the Hillary Clinton campaign, making up false claims about them to coerce them to come to the table and negotiate their own punishment. And if I may just explain the example of the Gordie Howe Bridge that I mentioned earlier, I think this is such a perfect example. We saw President Trump block the opening back in early June when the ribbon cutting was ready to go. We also know that the owner of the Ambassador Bridge made a $1 million donation to Trump's political action committee. And so we saw this delay. And by the way, estimates say that the privately owned Ambassador Bridge collects $150,000 a day in tolls. It wasn't until 46 days later that he coerced Canada to come back to the negotiating table, even though the original deal had Canada paying for the entire bridge and agreeing to recoup it through the first $4.3 billion it collected in tolls. And instead, what President Trump said is, we need a better deal. I want to negotiate a better deal. Now, ultimately, the deal he negotiated is really no better, because it says that the US and Canada are going to split the tolls, but not until after there's a net toll. So it's really the same deal. What happened in the meantime? What did he achieve? Well, he achieved 46 days of closure. 46 times $150,000 is something like $6.9 million that went to the Ambassador Bridge in the meantime. So a pretty good deal for, if this really was a quid pro quo. I don't know that it was. This was, certainly the way politics gets played these days, but it's certainly a dirty way of playing politics. And this is the way that Trump extracts money, extracts profit, rewards his friends to the detriment of the public, people here in Michigan, businesses in Michigan, as well as in Canada.
It's sad. And what's interesting, we just had the official opening this past weekend, and there was nothing on the American side, just the Canadian side, though our governor did drive across the bridge. So maybe something was achieved. You were deeply involved as a U.S. attorney with the Department of Justice. Tell us about your concerns regarding how the Department of Justice is operating now in Trump's second term.
Well, yeah, so in the post-Watergate era, there have been norms at the Department of Justice to maintain the independence of the Justice Department and to base decisions on facts and law and the fair administration of justice. Back when we were charging Kwame Kilpatrick and his allies, nobody from the Obama administration ever told me what to do, what not to do. They had no role in it whatsoever. It was all local decision making, and it was all based on facts and law. I was appointed by a Democratic president. It never occurred to me to consider politics whatsoever, or any of our people in that case. And yet what we're seeing today, I think, is an effort to use the Justice Department to go after some of President Trump's political rivals. And in fact, Todd Blanche, who's the acting attorney general, may soon be confirmed, has actually embraced that role of the president, in his words, calling the shots. And he says, after all, the executive branch is part of what the president runs under Article 2. And so he can do that. And Americans should be happy that the president is making sure we're working hard. What he overlooks is that there's also a clause in Article 2 of the Constitution that says that the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so in an effort to ensure faithful execution, most presidents since Watergate have respected the DOJ norms. Just because they can assert their power over the Justice Department does not mean that they should. It does not mean that it is wise to do so or just to do so. And so what we have now is a president calling the shots. One of the previous norms was that the president in the White House should not communicate with the Justice Department about specific cases. They can talk about priorities. This president could say, I want to make immigration enforcement one of my priorities. There's no problem with that. But it's drilling down on particular cases. So when he sends a social media post that says Pam to Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of the United States, why haven't we charged Jim Comey and Letitia James and Adam Schiff? People are saying that they're guilty as hell and justice must be served. That would never have flown during the prior, 40, 50 years since the Watergate era. It was considered not only inappropriate, but damaging to the rule of law because it tends to undermine public confidence that the Justice Department is actually seeking justice and not simply doing the president's bidding. And so, these cases against Jim Comey with the 8647 with the seashell, or the charges against the man to charge Atkin and Senator Mark Kelly and some other members of Congress for making a video where they correctly and about
Mark Kelly and Lisa Slotkin and the others who made the video correctly stating military law, and they're going after them. I mean, it's terrifying what's going on. And what's interesting, since you wrote your book, Barbara, it seems the corruption has got even worse with the attempts to fix the deal with the Treasury Department and just the grift that's being made by Trump and his family, billions of dollars in the second term. Is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I'd love to say a word about this, as a slush fund, and explain why this is so outrageous for people who might not be lawyers. So in the first instance, we have Donald Trump, who claims to be the unitary executive. The Supreme Court has now recognized that, and he is the boss of the entire executive branch. He files a lawsuit against the IRS and the Treasury Department. Now, if he has a legitimate beef against longer the president to file a lawsuit. And the basis of his lawsuit is genuine. He had his tax returns disclosed by an IRS contractor unlawfully. Now, that person was prosecuted during the Biden administration criminally and was sentenced to 5 years. There were about 400,000 people who had their tax returns disclosed by this person. And the other people who filed lawsuits, you know what they got? They got an apology. Donald Trump sought $10 billion, saying that his business reputation had been harmed. There's no proof that he's can support that. In fact, if anything, his net worth has only grown since this happened in 2019. But he files this lawsuit anyway. And then the Justice Department, in responding, fails to do what it has done in every other one of these cases. That is, number one, to assert the statute of limitations. This claim is time barred. It happened in 2019. You filed your lawsuit in 2025. I'm no math, but I think that's more than the 2 years that the statute of limitations permits. Other cases, that the statute was asserted. They did not assert sovereign immunity, which says you can sue this guy, but you can't sue the IRS or the Treasury for this loss, for this harm. They asserted this in the other cases, not in the case against Donald Trump. Nor did they demand that he trace the losses that amount to $10 billion. Show us evidence that you've done this. Instead, on the day, 2 days before a brief was due for the court to say, explain to me how this is a case over which a court has jurisdiction, which requires true adversity between parties. Explain to me how Donald Trump as an individual can sue the IRS and the Treasury Department when he's the boss of all of these people and can fire anybody who does things he doesn't like. 2 days before those briefs are due, he dismisses his case and announces there will be a settlement out of court with the Justice Department. Todd Blanche negotiates that settlement. So they've never pursued the aggressive defense on the American people, on behalf of the American people that we would expect. And now they agree to set up a weaponization compensation fund in the amount of not $10 billion, but $1.776 billion. Now, I'm sure that number reflects the year of our nation's Declaration of Independence, but it just tends to show it's not really traced to any loss. But the other part of this that was so offensive is that gets announced on a Tuesday. And then the next day, kind of under the radar, there's also an announcement that in addition, Donald Trump will receive immunity, as well as his sons and his businesses, from tax audits for any return filed up until that date forever. And there are some experts who estimate his amount of unpaid taxes. Remember, people are asking him to show the returns, and he claims he's under audit. There are experts who say the amount of unpaid taxes is $100 million. And so Todd Blanche took our taxpayer money and gave $100 million of it to Donald Trump. That's why people were so outraged. Now, there was a court decision recently that said that that is null and void because there was no true adversity between the parties. But this is something that Todd Blanche tried to do, and now he wants to be our nation's attorney general. I think it just shows, she used the word in her opinion, self-dealing, the kind of self-dealing that we have seen and can expect with Todd Blanche at the helm of the Justice Department.
Well, hopefully it won't be confirmed. I mean, during the confirmation hearings, as you well know, he said or misspoke and said, yes, I am the president's attorney. And let's go to another area, and that is, as you said early in our conversation, the fix is also how do we fix this mess? So why don't you tell us how we go to some solutions in fixing the current mess that we're in?
Yeah, I think if I were to say the most important fix that I could suggest for our political system, it would be the big money that's in politics. The Supreme Court decided a case in 2010 called Citizens United.
Right.
It was a case that said that corporations have the same rights as individuals to make independent expenditures on behalf of candidates, and there cannot be any limits under the First Amendment. I think that was wrongheaded. I think it could be overturned by another court. I think we've got new facts to demonstrate just how harmful that has been to our democracy, because we've got expenditures in the hundreds of billions of dollars now on campaigns. And it means that it really dilutes the power of the rest of us to control the outcome of what happens, whether it's ballot initiatives or candidates for public office. So eliminating that, the easiest, cleanest way to do it would be with a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. We could seek, bring cases to chip away at it. Or one really interesting solution we're seeing in a couple states, Montana and Hawaii have pursued this, is that they are amending the power that they give to corporations to make them powerless to make political contributions, which I thought was pretty interesting. But that's really opened the floodgates to dark money. And so I'd really like to see a change there. I think it has really caused corruption. It's not the kind of quid pro quo, but it has caused outside influence for special interest. When you wonder, why can't we resolve things like background checks for guns? Why is it we can't get these laws passed, or maybe some common sense regulations of social media? Well, there's billionaires out there who don't want to lose their goose that laid the golden egg, and so they'll do anything to prevent legislation from happening. And the crypto industry is another one that has really come on and is donating millions of dollars to candidates, which in my view is not representing the interests of ordinary people.
Well, it's interesting, Barb. Today I saw something that said that the crypto fund that the Trump family is involved in is now being accused of some very gross corruption. So what can I say? It goes on and on. Barb, in another area you talk about are lessons that we can learn from outside of the United States. Would you please expound on that for our viewers?
Yeah, I think that we've seen a really interesting situation recently in Hungary, where Viktor Orban led a regime that's really similar to what we're seeing today. He proudly referred to it as an illiberal democracy. And one of the ways you build a coalition of billionaires who want to make more money, and people who maybe feel left behind, rural voters, pandering to religion, pandering to racism, pandering to xenophobia. And in that way, he was able to build a coalition and stay in power. He lost his election this spring. And his opponent, Peter Magyar, did something I think was very clever. And that was, number one, he called out the corruption. Calling out the corruption and exposing it, I think, is critically important. Donald Trump famously said, was quoted in the New York Times recently as saying, why are you suddenly investing in the stock market and crypto and doing all of this self-dealing? And he said, I realize people don't care. And that may be true, but I think we need people to care. And that's one of the things Peter Magyar did, is really opening people's eyes to how much it was costing us, the people, when he engages in this self-dealing and this kind of corruption. But the other thing was building coalitions against parties. And so, reaching out to those populists that had voted for Viktor Orban, people who felt behind, rural voters, religious voters, and also the progressive voters who care about issues like affordability. There's a lot of crossover there in terms of interests. Affordability, I think, has become a really important issue. The wealth disparity in this country has grown tremendously since the 1980s. To listen to Donald Trump, the reason for this wealth disparity is because of DEI and minorities and immigrants. In my view, the real reason for this wealth disparity are the financial policies that began in the Reagan administration and have only grown worse. Deregulation, corporate tax cuts, CEO salaries. Those are the things that are driving this wealth gap that leaves many people far less well off than they were in their parents' generation. And so I think if we in the United States look to that formula, we could do the same thing, right? I think affordability is such an important issue. I think that some in government want to focus on our areas of difference. It's why they stoke dissent by talking about things like transgender issues or reproductive health issues. They know that they can get people stoked up about those kinds of things and vote only on that basis. But I think that we could reach more coalition by looking at where do we have interests in common. And I think affordability is one of those issues that could really bring together progressives and populists that could help unite ordinary Americans as opposed to special interest in big business.
Important points you're raising. I mean, the old trickle-down Reaganomics does not really trickle down. What are some of the solutions that you propose as well to help get us out of our current mess? What are some other solutions?
Yeah, well, let me suggest one for each of the three branches of government. One is the legislative branch, right? Article 1. I think the way we choose our members of Congress needs to be reconsidered. One of the things that has happened in this day and age is something like 85% of the seats are entrenched as red or blue. And in that way, a president can threaten to primary somebody who doesn't get on board with his issue and can probably win that seat. And so what we're seeing is more and more extreme people controlling Congress. I think a better choice might be to use ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting tends to moderate the more extreme voices because what it means is you can't have one candidate win 30% and another win 30% and some other candidate win 40% and waltz in without getting a true majority. With ranked choice voting, you can eliminate people's second choice and then have a head-to-head competition where a moderate voice could take the seat. I think that's worth exploring. And some states already do it. They do it in Maine and Alaska, where we have seen Lisa Murkowski get elected, a very moderate Republican. In the executive branch, I would really love to see those DOJ norms that we talked about, that we've known since Watergate, become codified into law. We probably can't have the legislature do it, but I'd love to see the next president, whether a Republican or Democrat, make these part of the code of federal regulations, these ideas of limiting communications with the White House, avoiding partisan politics in charging decisions. I think those would be critically important. And then when it comes to the judiciary, I would do a couple things. One is create an inspector general who could require ethics reports when people are receiving gifts and report that to Congress for oversight. I think that might have a deterrent effect over what's happening with some of the acceptance of gifts, which I think really undermines public trust in the judiciary. I also think we should consider moving from the executive branch to the judicial branch, the U.S. Marshal Service. They would then have the power to have somebody to back up their orders when somebody in the executive branch disobeys one. I know that we've seen people like Todd Blanche and others say, yeah, go ahead, court, make your order. Who's going to enforce it? Well, if they had the U.S. Marshal Service there, they already provide courthouse security. They move prisoners. They have jails in the courthouse. Then if a judge found an executive branch employee in violation or contempt of a court order, he could order the Marshal Service to go lock him up. I think that would have a deterrent effect on some of these disobedience of court orders.
It sure would. These are excellent suggestions. Now let's get to individuals. What can we do as individuals to take back our democracy?
Yeah, this is one of those things that I think is so great. There's an Anne Frank quote that goes something like, how wonderful it is that we need not wait another moment before we do something, ourselves to take action to make a positive change in the world. And that's absolutely true when it comes to democracy. There's so much any of us can do. We can knock on doors and write postcards and all of those kinds of things for various organizations. And if you don't know where to get started, there are so many great groups out there who always need volunteers. I often send people to the League of Women Voters. Their job is to provide good and accurate information to voters. In this day and age when we don't know who to trust and there are all kinds of AI generated slop on the social media, the League of Women Voters is out there doing voter guides, candidate forums, and they need people just to staff their events or help prepare these questionnaires. So that's a great place. Indivisible is a wonderful organization that's not partisan. They're committed to just grassroots democracy building tasks. And they, if you want to knock on doors for an hour on a Saturday, they can set you up and help you. Even volunteering to be a poll worker, Henry, on election day. I think this election is going to be a big one. And they need reliable people to show up there and make sure that there isn't mischief that occurs at our polling places. So lots of ways we can plug in. We can run for office. We can participate in protests. There is a researcher I cite in the book named Erica Chenoweth, who has studied regime change all over the world and concluded that if even only 3.5% of the electorate participate in peaceful protest, they can effect regime change. And finally, the easiest thing that any one of us can do is just talk to our friends and neighbors. You don't have to talk about policy issues. Just talk about good government, about democracy, about why it's important that we be engaged. I think, there may be supporters out there whose minds you're never going to change, but I also think there are a lot of people who simply aren't paying attention to some of the attacks we're seeing on our media, our universities, all the institutions of government that protect our democracy, and just help them to wake up and see what's going on. I think that could be a really important way to contribute to the fix.
Absolutely. We've got about 20 seconds left. What final thoughts do you want to share before we sign off, Barbara?
Democracy is not a spectator sport. I think all of us need to do our part. Whatever you can do, please do it. It's going to help our democracy in the long run.
Also, vote.
Vote might be the easiest one of all. Please vote.
Barbara McQuade, as always, you're excellent and a wonderful book. I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying. I want to thank our sponsors, Bloomfield Cable, and of course our viewers for watching Gracefully Graying. Barbara McQuade, thank you so much.
Thank you, Henry.